Welcome to the Speak with People podcast. My name is Jason Raitz. I'll be your host, and this podcast exists to help you improve your communication skills. Whether you communicate one-on-one, to a team, from a stage, or from behind a screen, we know that when we improve our communication skills as leaders, it exponentially changes everything. It improves our relationships, it improves our leadership skills, and it improves our business skills. So let's get ready to dive into this next episode. Well, you are in for a treat with this episode of the Speak with People podcast. First time I talked with Krystal, I was just blown away by her ability to connect. And she said a phrase that really kind of drew me in. She said this phrase, I don't believe in the golden rule. Why I don't believe in the golden rule is what I wrote down in my notes. And I thought, I've got to talk to her more about that on the podcast. We are going to dive into communication. We're going to talk about business and communication. And her book, The Best Robot Wins. She is the U.S. Christian Chamber of Commerce president. And I am so excited to welcome her to the Speak with People podcast. Welcome, Krystal.
Thank you so much. Speak with People. I am so excited to be here today.
Absolutely. Well, hey, before we jump into the conversation, before we talk through some of these things, I wondered if you could just give us a little bit more of your story, who you are, where you're from, maybe your top 7 failures and what you learned from each of those. No.
I love it.
No, just kidding. Would love to know more of your story.
Yeah. Well, I could give you one of my big failures, and that happened. I mean, they happen often. They'll just say that. So top 7 wasn't any stretch. Okay.
Yes.
But the one that really rings out to me was, leaving my small town of 300 to go to college, leaving it all behind. And I dropped out of college with 21 hours left. And that sent me from KU, which was 30,000 students, all the way back to a town of 300 people to try to figure out, where do you go from here? Like, how do you do life and start over? And so that was what I would have considered a failure. But now looking back on it, I realize the only way I would have failed if I would have just, fell into the life and ways of that little town and never got out. At that time, my friends were doing all kinds of ornery things and typical, 20-year-old things of people that don't have strong relationship with the Lord. But I just chose a different route. So I started stocking shelves for a truck parts store, which happened to be a subsidiary of an oil and gas company. And in just 12 years, I finished my undergrad in psychology. I was promoted as the youngest executive in a Fortune 200 oil and gas company. I was running the gas company in 47 cities on the west side of Texas, on the whole west side of Texas, and all of customer service for Texas. And then later went on to take over all of customer service for the 3 distribution companies, which was the largest natural gas distribution companies in the U.S. We were J.D. Power's award winning. And man, it was cool. All because of my failure, right? No, all because of what I thought at the time was a failure. Man, I felt like such a loser. And it was amazing how just staying focused and just doing the next right thing. That's one thing I learned through that was we're not always going to make the right decision. We're not always going to do the right thing. But what's the next right thing? And then just do it. And so I did get my undergrad in psychology. I ended up getting my master's in marketing. And then when the top brass heard about me doing that, they sent me to Harvard Business School for senior executive leaders. And I got to focus on globalization, innovation, and leadership diversity. And that was a really cool season in my life. But the door shut and I moved on to the next things. And so it's been a really neat path. Now I have my own company. I work a lot with the Christian chambers, and as the president of the U.S. Christian Chamber of Commerce, I was telling you this earlier, but I really do feel like I have a newborn child, even though I don't. Mine is 17, but this is in startup phase for the U.S. Christian Chamber of Commerce. We've only been around not even for a full year yet.
Wow.
And we're having a massive conference. This will be after the conference. So, but we're just I mean, blowing and going. And like I said, showers optional, sleep is optional.
Mm.
We're all focused on the prize, and that is just really launching this in our nation right now.
Wow. Wow, just amazing. Well, and I love what you do, and we'll definitely tell the Speak with People email list and Facebook group and whoever we can about the conference because it is so valuable. Let's go way back. Sorry to your story. So you're driving home after dropping out of college. Would you have ever, in your wildest imagination, fast forward 12 years, think about all that happened to you? I mean, just amazing how one of those moments, and then you look back and then, I mean, you have experienced some incredible leadership during that time.
Yeah, honestly, if I could be so candid, I can't tell you how many times I had to pull my car over.
Mm,
It was a 6.5 hour drive across Kansas. And I had to pull my car over so many times to just fix myself
yep.
because driving back into a town of 300 people, in a town that you were just set that you were going to never come back to
Yep.
ever,
Yep.
to have to go back with your tail between your legs as a failure, right?
Oof.
And everybody knew I was coming home, I'm sure, before my car even ended up in my parking
Mm,
lot of my mom and dad's house.
mm,
And I mean, that was a really low point for me, man. But that wouldn't have been the lowest point. I've had a few other ones
mm.
too. But it's not really. I've heard this quote before. I love it, and it's life is only about 20% what happens to you, and 80% what you choose to do with it.
Yes.
And I think that's probably even more than the 80-20 rule. I think it's more like 10% what happens to you and 90% what you choose to do with it.
Yep.
Nobody's got a silver spoon and a perfect life, and the people that you really think that do, then you fell into a trap of comparison. And what I
Yep.
would say is the fastest way to kill something special is to compare it to something else. And so when you just
Ooh.
stay focused on your journey and your path, then you become really special because you are. You're unique, your stories, everything I went through, I know that I went through to prepare me for what I get to do today.
Wow. It's just so true. I was interviewing a guest maybe last fall. We did a leadership series, and they wrote a great book called "Are You Who You Want to Be?" And he
Ooh,
just spoke to just what you talked about there. I mean, each of us are so unique. We've been designed and crafted in a way that there will never be another one of us, and so why waste it? Comparing and doing all these other things. I mean, it's just
yeah,
completely
good.
powerful. I love your story. You're stocking shelves, and then you blink, and now you're overseeing things for the state of Texas. I hear the state of Texas is kind of large.
It's pretty large. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
well, when I was stationed in El Paso, I always said that Southwest Airlines was my taxi. Like, people think
Mm,
you would drive across the state of you don't, you fly. Like, it
wow.
is so large.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So those early days of when you started getting into the corporate leadership, at whatever step of that journey was, when did you start to recognize, or maybe take us to maybe even a moment when you found out how important communication skills were to your role in the company? Was there a moment, was there a time, was there something that happened where you went, okay, boy, I've got to be really effective with these communication skills because this is really, because my premise is I think most of us executive leaders, we get to a place where we that kind of, something went off and went, wait a minute, the better I communicate, this is really, guiding this a good way. I'm curious what you think about that.
So well said, and that's so true. There was a pivotal piece in the communication journey. Well, first of all, I was a psychology major.
Mm.
So, and I was surrounded in a sea of engineers and men in an oil and gas company. So I
Yes.
was very different than,
Yes.
so there's that unicorn thing, that individual thing. So I did communicate well, and especially help them communicate
Yes.
their very complex ideas into, natural language. But the one thing that really is pivotal for me was early. So I was stocking shelves, and then I went on to be the secretary. And I remember going to my boss, and I was the only woman in the gathering transportation side out in the small towns. And I said, I want to grow and I want to make more money and I want to, do things. And he looked at me and he said, well, he said, you're probably going to have to take another office job somewhere else because you can't really go up anymore from here, because he didn't see a path for me because I was a woman and it was men and it was hard work. And that's okay. Because that's all he knew. He wasn't saying it to be mean. He just was,
Yeah.
he didn't see it for me. And so I took his advice and I went and got another job. And so I went from the field into HR. And when I was in HR, I was serving both union and non-union employees in the
Mm.
benefits side of the company. And I went all the way back 6.5 hours back out towards Kansas City is where I went. And what ended up happening after I left was one of the employees that was in the field that I knew personally, his son was on a four-wheeler and his son had a very bad accident
Mm.
and died, unfortunately.
Oh.
And when it came time for him, I mean, this is a horrible tragedy. You never want to hear this happen for anybody, especially someone you know.
Yep.
As a grieving parent, the very last thing you ever want to have to deal with is calling up to get the accidental death and life insurance and being told this: you didn't check the box.
Oh.
Because they didn't check the box, because they didn't know they needed to check the box, it hit me like a ton of bricks that as somebody responsible for benefits, that would never happen on my watch.
Mm.
And because we had unions, so we opened up a call hotline. We could not over communicate enough the importance of these boxes and every little nuance that
Wow.
had to come on these benefits. And from there on, communication has been a huge
Mm.
key of not just to your customer, but to your peers, to up, down, all around. Communicate. You can. And I had a boss that said it this way, and I loved it. She said, "Over communicate to make up for the complexity of structure."
Mm.
Over communicate to make up for the complexity of structure, and that just has always been with me. I wrote about it in my book because it was um, so pivotal for me. So that was the one communication story that just forever haunted me, helped me, and I carried with me.
It's just incredible. It's just incredible. And it's just, I mean, how many times has, maybe not to that degree, and obviously, boy, that's a horrible tragedy, but just even in our day-to-day communicating around the office or with family members, sometimes it's those simple little things that we just pass over, that come back, and we're like, okay, we got to slow down, make sure
It's
everyone understands this.
Oh, it's so true. Well, and there was another time when I was in HR, it's another big one. Was in cubicles outside of a conference room. I was probably 20, let's go with 24-ish. Okay, so I was a kid. And here every day, this man and woman and a mediator would go into the conference room where I could hear them for at least 4 or 5 days in a row, and there would be the loudest screaming,
Oh,
yelling, crying, and it was terrible as a young business person to have to listen to it because it was so loud. It was coming through the walls of that
yeah.
conference room. But it also hit me, it struck me, why can't they weren't married, they weren't in a relationship, like, I mean,
Right.
not that you couldn't do that with your spouse, but I'm just saying, like, in
Yep.
the big picture, their relationship was completely work. But for some reason, with a mediator, they were at odds and openly at odds, which seems so odd to me. But here's what it was. It cost the money, it cost the company money. There's many, many unintended consequences and outcomes of lack of ability to communicate with coworkers. I'm sure it took precedence in the workplace. It cost money. We had mediators in there. I mean, you have a 20-year-old person out there that's getting inducted into business in this environment. And I remember thinking, why can't they just get along? What could
Mm.
be so bad that they can't get along?
Yep.
Forever, that one stuck with me too, from the early 20s.
Right. Wow. Wow. So valuable. Okay. So our first conversation, we were talking and getting to know each other and connecting, and we were kind of go back and forth. And I remember writing down, when it comes to communication, you don't necessarily believe in the golden rule. And so I was like, okay, let's dive into that. I'm so curious what you think about
Let's hear the Christian lady talk about not believing in the golden rule.
that. Yes.
Yeah, well, that is true. Well, let's start with what the golden rule is. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And as you study personalities and communication styles of personalities, they're all very different.
Yes.
Just some people, if you haven't noticed, and I'm sure your audience can attest to this as well, but some people talk really fast and they go like this and they're always in a hurry and they always have a lot to say and they say it really fast. And therefore, if they come up to somebody that is a very slow talker, that likes to process and
Yep.
think and maybe a little softer, the person that's talking like this, that's going really fast, is going to inherently just annoy the slow talker. And so, therefore, what we have to do as leaders and communicators is we've got to know, listen, and understand the style of the people that we're talking to so that we can
Mm.
pace ourselves, that we can communicate in their style. So that all of that, there's all kinds of mediums and distractions and things that help make it so that our message is not heard. And
Yes.
actually, it's a very small percentage that actually is verbally communicated. And so we want that little 7% of verbal communication to hit their ears. But if we're communicating in our style and not taking into account the way that they feel, the way that they communicate, the way that they need to hear it, the message, then your little opportunity to be heard is nil practically.
Mm.
And then there's one more piece of this, and it's body posture and position as
Mm.
well. So, one thing I learned working with men is that most men, and forgive my generalization, but most of the men that I worked with, they tend to not talk. Now, this could change now because of all of the Zoom that we've done and how it's positioned. But
Yep.
typically back then, men would talk or stand shoulder to shoulder with a slight turn in and talk. And so what I realized is that when I go to the men and talk, I like to talk in your face. And when I talk to the engineers, I like to talk with my hands. And engineers typically don't use a lot of expressive language. They certainly don't want you in their face with all
Right.
kinds of expressions like I have on my face right now. And so I learned that when I was talking with the men, I was better to be heard and listened to if I did more of a shoulder to shoulder talk.
Mm.
I would literally take these weapons, these hands of mine, and I would take them when I would go into my boss, who was a very, very strong engineer, C style leader. I would literally take these things and sit on them
Mm.
so that I did not speak with my hands, so that my boss could hear me and respect what I was saying to him. So, when it comes to communication, the golden
Wow.
rule does not always apply in
Yes.
that situation.
So good. So good. And it's so clickbait, right? To say that, and then you dive into it and you're like, no, it makes total sense. I interviewed a great two great authors maybe 2 months ago, 3 months ago on the podcast. They wrote a book called Adaptive Listening, and they said,
Oh,
it's we've got to be like just what you talked about. We got to be able to adapt, and they've kind of come up with a listening quiz called the SAID listening style, SAID, and you're
okay.
just what you talked about. You're able to find out, okay, I work with Krystal, we work every day. I listen differently than she does, so I've got to know, how to communicate in a way that she'll be able to listen. I mean, talk about being able to advance your career
Ooh,
if you're able to learn those things.
it's so good, and I'll take it a step further with what you're saying. Part of one of the questions I get asked is, "How did you do it in 12 years? Go to
Mm.
be a dropout to an executive in a Fortune 200 company?" And I always say, "Well, I'm not that smart, obviously." My dad told me that too when I was young. But what I was good at was picking people different than me, and I was
Mm.
good at leading them. And the thing that leaders sometimes stumble on is they pick people on their teams and they gravitate towards people on an unconscious bias towards people that are like them.
Mm,
And so therefore their thoughts are all aligned. They're not thinking different. They're not thinking outside of the box. They're not touching all of the bases, and they have blind spots. So what I was good at and what I enjoy doing is putting people around me very, very different than me, so that I we can accomplish more, reach
yep.
more, touch more, serve more. And to do that, people say, okay, I can do that. I'm going to pick a D on a disc scale, an I, an S, and a C, and I'm going to put them there. But if you don't have strong leadership or strong communication skills, or teach them how to communicate, you could have that break room where you have just complete explosions
Right.
happening. So that's the other piece of it, and how it could be really beneficial.
Wow. Wow. Do you, in your experience, working with those companies and now on your own when you've consulted and now with all the businesses that you talk to, where do you think, I mean, I hate to generalize it, but do you think smaller, medium, larger companies, who do you think does the best with some of that learning and development skills? Because companies are hiring, younger leaders are hiring people all the time, but they come in not necessarily having those skills, knowing where to get those skills. Do you think, is there a certain size company that does better? Is there a certain company in a different, certain field that values that learning and training process and is able to help develop staff? Or, have you come across that, if there's one that kind of stands out among the others?
Yes, I have. And it's a really great, solid question. I found that larger companies tend to invest in personal growth and development more than smaller companies. And a lot of it has to do with the smaller the company, the more people are involved in the day to day.
Mm,
It's harder for them to break away. And so they're more focused on training on actual processes, or training on, turning the widget or pushing the button. Whereas larger companies that have budgets and resources and people to absorb the work, so the work still goes on,
mm,
they tend to make those investments in personal development. And actually, what we're finding statistically is companies that make those personal development investments are using that as a retention methodology
mm,
more so. People want to go work for companies that they can get developed than people that going to work for companies where it's not a value. So what I would say, really encouraging the smaller businesses, because I've worked with all the different sizes, is that I know that taking a day out, or allowing your employee to take a day out for personal development, communication, it's one of those things. And I'll go back to a biblical reference, but we saw this when Jesus retreated to the mountaintop after he
mm.
fed the 5,000. He went and just wanted to spend time with the Father. And the disciples were out on the water, and they're rowing all night, laboring, 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 laboring. After Jesus refreshed with the Lord, he then just went out, walked on the water, and caught up with them. Like, he's
Right.
just strolling along. So, what I tell people is sometimes you have to reset in the supernatural to accelerate in the natural. Well,
Wow.
let's put that in plain terms. For your company to grow, you've got to raise the leadership level. Otherwise, you're going to be at the lid. I love John Maxwell, the law of the lid. If you're at a 4, you're going to attract 4 and under leaders on a scale of 1 to 10.
Yep.
So your job as the leader is to grow everybody.
Mm,
Rising tide lifts all ships. And so what happens in these smaller businesses is they hit their lid, and because they're so mirrored in the day-to-day business and the tasks and the encumbrances, they don't see that there could be value in development. But it's the greatest asset in a company for them to develop leadership and leaders, so that the rising tide can lift the boat. So it's easy in the larger companies. It's harder to pull it out in the small companies, but the smaller companies need it as much or more than the bigger companies. And I would just say that take a look at your investment, your training, your budget, and just put a little bit in. Even if
mm.
you don't have any dollars associated with it this year, put a little bit in and see how it can really make a difference. Because, like that first example I told you, where people are fighting in the break room, that costs you money.
Right.
That costs you time. That costs your bottom line, your ability to serve customers. And what wouldn't you rather put money in for training than have to spend money on that garbage? So
Yep.
I would just
Yeah.
encourage you, get in it, get in it, do it.
Boy,
There's
that's,
great people that
gosh,
can
that's
help
so
you.
powerful. Oh, that's so good. So powerful, so practical. I interviewed an amazing attorney earlier today for an episode of the podcast, and she specializes in conflict, and she's
Okay.
mediated thousands of, courses. She wrote a great book on, conflict, but just even thinking about just if companies, how much time have they lost with people, at odds, staff members at odds with each other, projects have been slowed down. If they just,
Yeah.
were to give each other give them some of the skills to be able to move into those, they could advance so much quicker.
Yes. Yes. Well
I love it.
said.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm, researching your website. I'm learning about what you do, and I see the phrase, which I've heard before. I laughed. I think there was an episode of The Office about it, but it's not personal. It's just business. It's just business.
Mhm.
Talk us through where are you at with that phrase?
Well, I have gotten beat up over that. Let me tell you. I have gotten it worse. So the title of my book, The Best Robot Wins, it ain't personal. It's just business. And I remember my editors and my publisher of the book was like, "We need you to change the name of the book," and I obviously didn't do that. Because it really was important for me to have that in there and to include that phrase. Here's the thing. I open it out with my very first sentence is, if culture eats strategy for breakfast, why are we still hungry? The point in the book is this: you can't swing too far on the leadership side without having some strategy, execution, plan,
Mm,
and you can't go too far on the strategy side without having leadership, people development, etc.
yeah.
And so, what I see when I'm working with companies and what I've just experienced in my time in business is that pendulum swings one way or the other. It's really hard to balance it.
Mm,
And at the end of the day, as wonderful it is to, and my book is really about the people, it's really about the people. I tell stories and really help people walk through how to set up their company and set the processes in place so that they can experience employee engagement,
wow.
communication, and simplicity for their employees to be successful. It's all about human capital. However, there is the caution on there that if you go too far on the human capital side without systems, plan, objective measurements, etc., then you can tip your company too far over where there is no strategy and execution, money, etc. And at the end of the day, if the company is not there, then it doesn't matter. People don't have jobs. And so it ain't personal.
Right.
It's just business. And that's really what I mean by that when I'm saying that. It's not to be rude, it's at the end of the day. There has to be money coming in. There has to be objective performance, KPIs, benchmark. There has to be processes and systems. Without that, the company is not supposed to be a big party for people to come and, burn their popcorn in the microwave and stink up the whole place and then talk about it for a week. Like, that's not what a business is intended to do. However, you've got humans in there. So
Right.
we want it to be a wonderful, beautiful place for people to come and express themselves, lean into who they are as people, find their purpose and find their passion, align that with the mission. And really, that is the competitive advantage in companies when you have the right people in the right place and you're just seeing just a 10x
Mm,
on performance over, because a chicken sandwich is just a chicken sandwich. There's something that makes it great at Chick-fil-A. Well, what is that, right?
yep.
And it's the people, it's the systems, it's that balance.
Yep.
And so at the end of the
So
day,
good.
though, at the end of the day, if they're not producing, if they're not making money, that company won't be around. It's not personal, it's just business. And I always say, business is my sport. I love business. It really makes me happy to think about business. And so
Yep.
that's what I get to do every day. And it's really cool to be able to
Oh,
do it.
I love that. My business coach says all the time, if you're not bringing in revenue, then you've got a great hobby.
Yeah, we don't want hobbies.
And
I was
I'm like, no, no, gotta, and that drives me, because especially
that's
for
a good
me,
thing.
right? I spent 26 years in nonprofits, with
Okay.
church leadership, and so now leading Speak with People the last year and a half, I've had to, reframework and figure out, okay, and we're pretty much, right now we have just a couple of us on the team. So it's like every day I've got to invest so much time in the prospecting, building relationships, sending emails, getting the word out. If I don't do that by the end of the week, I'm wondering, how come I didn't book any speaking engagements? How come I don't have any more coaching? Okay, well, I didn't those
Yes.
KPIs. I need to be able to, hit all of that stuff. And you're right. It's so important.
Good.
I was a giant fan of The Office. You watch The Office, and Michael Scott, would say, "You guys are just working for the weekend. I'm working for the week." Like we're a family here, and I'm like, yeah, you're like, just like you said, we are human beings. We can make the culture this amazing place that you want to be a part of, but there also has to be that accountability and the clear communication. This is why you're here. Let's go
Yeah.
after it. I love
Yeah.
that.
Yes. And I really think people appreciate it, especially your performers.
Yeah.
Your performers really appreciate when there's boundaries because they're coming in and they're smashing it every day. And then they look over at, Patty, who's not, and go, well, why is she still here? And what I'm doing really doesn't matter. And it,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make a difference. And so that's how that poor culture sets in. And it's not because the supervisors are negligent or not doing their job. They just don't have the right structure to help them do their job. And so this is at every level in the organization where you can see it be a real benefit.
Yeah. With your consulting work, when you come into a company that's just, they're struggling with revenue, they're, trying to figure out, okay, why are we not, drawing what we need to draw, and you look over everything, is there a commonality a lot of the times? Can you point pretty quickly to their processes or to their vision or to their product? I mean, is there something, is it all the above? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, well, that's a really good question. I've never been asked that. That's a great question. I like to start with the finances. I think that always tells a story. I love to see the P&L. I like to see what's going on in the balance sheet. And then the next thing I say is, tell me what you're looking at. How are you measuring your business? And
Mm.
typically, right there is first of all, the P&L might be clean. They might have the finances, but they don't understand or know what they're looking at specifically or looking for. And then they certainly don't see how that ties into their measurements and what they're looking at in as far as how the business is running.
Mhm.
Or another one is, let me see your org chart. uh, well, we've grown so fast, we don't have one. Okay, you've got 75 employees and you don't have an org chart, or 100 or whatever. So, it's just really, I see a lot of businesses that have done very well. They've scaled quickly, 100x, 300x, whatever, and then they just didn't get prepared with the things in place. That's why a lot of times on the life cycle of a business, you see people go from the blowing and going, they're running up to that mature
Yep.
organization piece, and you see a total change out of leadership. And it's, some people are great at the startup, but they don't maybe do well in a more process driven culture. So in my book, I talk about that in terms of simplicity, because when a company gets to a super mature stage, that can also be a killer. It's not
Mm.
just going from new to that. We see it with Microsoft. Microsoft almost was a dying horse. I think when Satya Nadella came in, he laid off 80,000 workers, and he wrote a memo that said, if you do not think your presence is necessary in the meeting, don't show up. They had put so many middle managers in place that they were so fat and so
Wow.
heavy and so bureaucratic. In a tech company, you
Wow.
cannot be slow, staunch, bureaucratic. And so they had to come and basically just like clip the vine. And so in my book, I use that. I use the parable of the seed sower to help leaders understand how to structure their organization so that they can have that simplicity within the company and not get sucked out by the thistles and thorns like those seeds did. And that to me is the visual of what happens when a company gets too fat, too processed, too over the top. Remember, again, balance. Too much on that side will tip that ship over. Too much on the people side will tip that over. So you've got to look for that balance.
Wow. 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 That is so good. Boy, our time has flown by, and I could ask you another 10 questions because this has been so rich. But let me steer the corner. Let me ask you some rapid fire questions because we like
Oh
to
boy.
ask our guests some of their favorite resources. And so we talk a lot about speakers on this podcast. Do you have a favorite speaker who you just love every single time they knock it out of the park? You love to recommend them. Who would that be?
Every single time knocks it out of the park. Honestly, I'm just somebody I truly enjoy listening to and thinks very wise and encouraging. And we had him at our expo a couple years ago, was Lou Holtz.
Mm,
That guy, he's just got wisdom in there and it's just gold. And so to have him on the platform and to hear him was really special. But that's somebody you can look back on his YouTube and see some of those old talks and then even to now what we heard. And it's just pretty amazing. I think he's a great speaker and somebody I really admire.
I love it. I love it. Is there a podcast or a YouTube channel that you either turn to because it's got a guilty pleasure and it kind of fills your energy, or there's a leadership development one that just, it challenges you, kind of propels you forward?
Yeah, there's a couple. I every week love to tune in to Elevation Church. Pastor Stephen Furtick is incredible. So if you are looking for inspiration, that's a great one right there is him. And then of course, Pastor Craig Rochelle,
Mm,
he's got a leadership podcast. It's not stained glass. It's really more plain glass, but he's a Christian like me and many people that are listening. And so therefore there might be some reference in there to Bible, but most of it is leadership driven. And that's Craig
mm.
Rochelle's leadership podcast is podcast gold.
I love it. And then is there a book, a leadership book that you recommend that every leader should read? I mean, this has got to be, it's got to be on the shelf. You got to read it. You got to go back to it.
100%. Yes, absolutely. 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, John Maxwell. That's right there, book gold.
Yep.
There've been a couple of iterations. Before I would go into any interview, and if you can imagine, I've had a few interviews in my corporate life, I would open that book and I would make note cards. And because they were looking for leaders as I rose up the ranks, and it just strengthened up my leadership sword so that I could go in. But yeah, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, John Maxwell. If
I
you
love it.
haven't read it, get it. If you haven't read it in a long time, dust it off.
I
That's
love it.
some good stuff right there.
I love it. Well, where can we send our listeners, our community group, to find more about you online? Of course, we're going to post your book and your resources, but what's the best place to send them?
You guys can find me at uschristianchamber.com. Go to the About Us. You'll find me there. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I like to cruise around LinkedIn quite a bit. And it's Krystal with the K Parker, comma, MBA. M like M is mom, B is in boy, A, MBA. And I'm out of Orlando, Florida. So you'll be able to find me there. And let's connect on LinkedIn and grow our networks together.
Boy, I love it. Krystal, thank you so much. I mean, this was so rich. You've given us so much wisdom and so many practical things that will help us improve in our workplace tomorrow. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for these incredible questions. Things that have never come up on a podcast before came up today because you're incredible. Speak with the people. Let's go.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for joining us on another episode of the Speak with People podcast. We hope that you were encouraged. We hope that you were inspired and challenged to improve your communication skills. I want to thank you again for being a part of the Speak with People podcast community. Make sure you don't miss out on being a part of the Speak with People Facebook community group. Just head to Facebook, type in Speak with People, scroll down and join our community because every single day we're encouraging each other, we're helping each other to improve our communication skills. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.